Welcome to Tom's True Crime, where we explore the darkest corners of human behavior. Today we delve into a chilling case in the quiet town of Madinsonville, Kentucky. February 14th, 2007. 2:09 a.m. County 911 received a call from a woman who is hysterical. The 911 operator cannot understand what she is saying. The caller is 37-year-old Tasha Detterer. The operator managed to calm her down a little. Tasha said, they shot my husband." "Who has shot your husband?" "I don't know who they were." "Did they come in your house and do this?" "Yes." It appears Tasha has been the victim of a home invasion, and her husband's been shot and is clinging to life. "Is your husband breathing?" Mr. Detterer is still alive because Tasha is yelling at him to lay still. "Honey, lay down, please." But his condition was dire. Tasha said, "A lot of blood, got a lot of blood." Deputies from the Hopkins County Sheriff's Office rushed to the scene. When sheriff's deputies arrived, they found 19-year-old Phillip Freeland lying near the front door, his hands and feet bound with twine. He was living with the Detterers. He was friends with them through Tasha's son. He was yelling for help. Tasha was further inside the house, her hands and feet bound with an electrical cord. She was tied around her hands with her hands in front, and the same cable ran down to her feet, and it was wrapped around her feet. She managed to get the cell phone to make the call. Tasha's husband, 40-year-old Doug Detterer, was in the bedroom. Despite the horrific nature of his wound, he was still alive. He was breathing, and he was making noise. With Doug clinging to life, the EMTs loaded him into the back of the ambulance while sheriff's deputies started going over the crime scene, looking for anything that might help identify the two home invaders. Deputies were looking for any evidence, a weapon that may have been used, a firearm, anything that would help them. For the moment, all they knew was that they had a very unusual crime on their hands. They had a victim of multiple gunshot wounds, two subjects that lived there that were tied up. The investigation would soon focus on what was happening inside the home of Doug and Tasha Detterer. It's the situation where you want to know what's the rest of the story. Born in 1969, Tasha McCann grew up in a small Ohio town raised by a family of devout fundamentalist Christians. She was a good girl, sang in the choir, a church girl. But when Tasha was a teenager, the family moved to Kansas, and soon after, the good girl rebelled against her religious upbringing. According to her family, she was sleeping around. She was kicked out of home when she became pregnant. She was 19 years old. Tasha married before giving birth to a son, Mason, in 1989, but the marriage didn't last. Mason was about 2 years old. Desperate for money to support herself and Mason, Tasha found work as an exotic dancer. One night, Andrew Hancock and his friends went to the bar where Tasha was working. They were watching the girls, chatting and drinking. They noticed a girl sitting at the bar in a formal evening dress. They didn't know who she was. Andrew said to his friends, "Let's put some money together and see if we can get her to get on stage. Take that dress off." The mystery girl acted really shy, but she said she would do it for them. So she got up on stage and she stripped for Andrew and his friends. Little did they know, the trick was on them. Andrew didn't find out until later that she worked there. It was Tasha. Andrew and Tasha started dating. When Tasha got pregnant, Andrew Hancock asked her to marry him. Tasha accepted. Tasha gave birth to a daughter, Amber. 2 years later, the couple had a son, Lucas, Tasha's third child. Life was going well for Andrew and Tasha. The family lived on some acreage, and for the first 5 or 6 years, they were happy. Things changed after Tasha convinced Andrew to give her the money to buy a friend's bar. Andrew and Tasha grew apart after she bought the bar. Andrew was losing a lot of money in the business. It eventually failed, and soon after, Andrew filed for divorce. A bitter custody dispute over their 2 children ensued. The divorce got ugly, and the judge awarded custody to Tasha. The divorce was still being finalized in 2004 when Tasha's uncle, Jeremy, died. Tasha, then 35-year-old, went home to Ohio with her children for her Uncle Jeremy's funeral. At the funeral was 38-year-old Doug Detterer, who had known Tasha since they were children. After the funeral, Doug, Tasha, and her children went to lunch together. When Doug was 15 years old, his mother died and the teenager moved in with Tasha's Uncle Jeremy. Uncle Jeremy was a kind person and a father figure to Doug. Doug was not close to Tasha back then because she moved to Kansas soon after Doug moved in. Her uncle's funeral was the first time she had seen Doug. Tasha and Doug were talking and were happy to see each other. They connected quickly and were all over each other at the local bar. After her Uncle Jeremy's funeral, Doug went back to Kentucky where he had been living for the last 10 years. Tasha soon followed. She moved to Kentucky within days, and within months, when Tasha's divorce was final, she and Doug were married. After the wedding, Doug and Tasha settled into a house he bought on the outskirts of Madinsonville. Doug worked at a car dealership near their house. Doug was very successful and was regularly the top salesman. Doug was the breadwinner. Tasha did not work outside the home. After Tasha and ex-husband Andrew Hancock agreed to a custody arrangement to avoid uprooting their children, Tasha's two youngest children stayed behind in Kansas with their father. Tasha's oldest son, Mason, who was almost 16 years old by then, went to Kentucky with her, but he soon moved out on his own. Mason was not living in the home, but he was a frequent visitor on weekends. In 2007, Tasha and Doug had taken in a friend of Mason's, 19-year-old Phillip Freeland. Phillip was having a hard time dealing with his parents' divorce, and he did not get along with his stepdad. Doug, remembering the kindness Tasha's Uncle Jeremy had shown him, invited Phillip to live with them. Doug treated him like his own son. Tasha doted on Phillip like he was her son. Before long, Phillip called Tasha Mom. Having Phillip around the house filled the void left behind by Tasha's youngest children, who chose to stay in Kansas. Tasha seemed to have a need to be a mother figure. Perhaps it is the feeling of being needed by someone. Tasha and Doug also helped 23-year-old Dolly Forrest. She was a transient and had lived in several different places. She was unemployed and had been arrested a few times for possession of marijuana. A mutual friend introduced Dolly to Tasha and Doug. They decided to help the troubled young woman. Tasha was paying her bills and giving her money, helped pay for a place for her to live. Although Dolly didn't live with Tasha and Doug, she considered them family. She was calling Tasha Mom and calling Doug Dad. But on Valentine's Day, 2007, after a brutal attack that left Doug fighting for his life, the authorities would be asking, did Tasha's need to take care of others lead to a tragic betrayal? In the early morning of Valentine's Day, 2007, the Detterer family appears to be the victim of a home invasion. Tasha's husband, 40-year-old Doug Detterer, was in the bedroom with a gunshot wound to the head. It appeared there was gray material oozing from the wound, which would be brain matter. So they knew this was serious. The EMTs immediately loaded Doug onto a stretcher and into the back of the ambulance. The crime scene is being disturbed, and it is possible that evidence is being destroyed, but life-saving measures take priority. A life flight helicopter was already en route as the EMTs rushed Doug to the local hospital, where there is a helipad. But by the time Doug reached the helipad, it was too late. He passed away in the back of the ambulance. Doug Detterer was dead. And in an instant, the focus shifted from saving his life to solving his murder. The deputies taped the scene off to keep people away from the scene. While the crime scene tape went up outside the house, Tasha and Phillip were inside giving sheriff's deputies a detailed account of the attack. The assailants were described as two unknown black males who had climbed in through a window. The window was in Phillip Freeland's room. Phillip reported that he was asleep in bed. He woke up to discover a black male holding a gun to his head and another one tying him up. He said that the male pointing the gun at him said that if he stays still and be quiet, he will not be harmed. Meanwhile, according to Tasha, she had been in the living room watching television. The first moment she becomes aware there is a problem is when Phillip Freeland is being escorted down the hallway with the two intruders armed with guns. They tie her up and shove her to the floor. Tasha said that based on what she had overheard, the two men were looking for some people. She stated that she had heard the name. They were looking for Maurice and Tyler. She didn't know who Maurice and Tyler were. She said that she had no idea why they were there, who they were, what they were upset about, and she had no explanation for what the two men did next. According to Tasha, the men opened the door to the bedroom where Doug Detterer was sleeping and began shooting. Tasha said that the killers fled after the shooting. They did not know how they fled, whether it was on foot or by car. But that changed when investigators escorted Tasha out of the house to take her down to the station for a formal statement. Once Tasha was outside the house, she immediately started screaming, my car, they took my car." Was it the break that could lead investigators to the killers? They get a description of the car, got on the radio, below that to other officers to be on lookout for that vehicle. There were more clues outside the house. They found something that seemed to confirm Phillip's story about the intruders coming in the window. They noticed a stepladder outside Phillip Freeland's window, and processing Doug's bedroom, crime scene technicians made an important discovery about the murder weapon. There were a couple of shell casings on the floor at the foot of Doug's bed. There is a gun cabinet in the living room with a door open, and there is a box of .380 ammunition in there, but they did not see a .380 caliber weapon. Is it a coincidence that Doug Detterer was shot with a .380 pistol? According to what Phillip told the investigators, the killers didn't need to shoot Doug with his own gun. According to Tasha and Phillip, both assailants were already armed when they entered the house. If Phillip was right, why would the killers take Doug's guns? Investigators had no idea what they were looking at. Was this a drug deal gone bad? Was this an old vendetta over something else? They had no clue. What they did know was that something wasn't adding up. So investigators turned to their two witnesses. It was 6 o'clock that morning before the investigators were finally able to sit down with Tasha and Phillip to take their formal statements. They were transported to the hospital, checked out, and then brought to the sheriff's department and ushered into separate interrogation rooms. They each gave the same account of the shooting that they had given at the scene. Tasha and Phillip repeated the story of this home invasion. However, the investigators soon noticed something about their individual stories. The substance of their story was the same, but there were small details that didn't match up. They had some discrepancies in the description of the assailants, what they were wearing, some of the sequence of events. A certain amount of discrepancy is expected. People are traumatized, especially someone like Tasha who had just lost her husband. She seemed shaken by it all. She had the stunned, deer in the headlight look. Phillip, on the other hand, didn't look stunned but very nervous. Investigators were suspicious of his claim that both intruders had been armed when they came in his window. One of the investigators brought Phillip back into the interrogation room for a second interview. They told Phillip Freeland that they don't believe his story. There were inconsistencies between what he and Tasha were saying. There were inconsistencies between what he was saying and the physical evidence. At that point, Phillip changed his story. In fact, Phillip didn't just change his story, he spilled the beans. He started naming names, including a name the investigators had not heard. Phillip said that Dolly was the shooter. She shot Doug. There is no home invasion by two unknown assailants. That's the first time investigators had heard the name Dolly. Dolly didn't live with Tasha and Doug, but she did depend on them financially. The Detterers provided financial support, including the trailer outside Madinsonville where Dolly lived. They paid the rent, they paid the utilities. So why would she kill Doug? According to Phillip, Doug Detterer was going to cut off the money. Phillip said that Doug's decision must have made Dolly furious because she was the one who had climbed in his window early that morning, went down the hall, grabbed the gun out of the cabinet, chambered around, and then shot Doug Detterer. According to Phillip, Dolly is the one that came up with a story about the two black men breaking in. As she was tying Phillip up, she said, "This is the story you tell." However, that did not make sense to investigators because if that was true, why would Phillip and Tasha tell that story once the sheriff's deputies arrived at the house? Investigators brought Tasha back in for another round of questioning. Tasha says that she lied in the first statement because she was afraid of Dolly. And like Phillip, Tasha said Dolly had murdered Doug because Doug decided to stop supporting her financially. While Tasha and Phillip's new stories matched, the investigators didn't believe them. Why wouldn't you have told that story the first time to say that you're afraid? Once the police arrived, they were no longer under threat. They were safe. Why didn't you tell law enforcement Dolly did it? It was not a plausible story. It didn't add up. Just after 7:30 that morning, while the investigators were finishing up with Tasha and Phillip, patrol officers found Tasha's stolen car. It was abandoned in a church parking lot, about a half a mile from Dolly's trailer. Had Tasha and Phillip actually been telling the truth? The vehicle did not yield any evidence. There was no weapon, nothing that ties back to the crime scene. However, even without the murder weapon, finding the car so close to Dolly's trailer was enough to send the deputies looking for her. They found her and brought her to the sheriff's department. And without telling her right away that Phillip and Tasha had accused her of murder, they asked Dolly about Tasha's car. She said Tasha gave her the car. She denied any involvement in Doug's murder. Investigators then told Dolly that Phillip and Tasha have ratted her out. They said she killed Doug. The news took Dolly by surprise. She became emotional. She felt she had been sold out by Phillip and Tasha. And in her anger about the betrayal, Dolly ended up making a damning admission. She's now saying that this was a conspiracy involving her, Phillip Freeland, Tasha Detterer. Dolly said Tasha was the mastermind. Tasha gave $30 and the car to Dolly for murdering Doug Detterer. Dolly claimed that the money and the car were not the reasons she did it. Tasha led Dolly to believe that Doug had been abusing her. Tasha said divorcing Doug will leave her with nothing. So the plan was for Dolly to kill Doug. However, according to Dolly, that wasn't the whole plan. The plan was to blame a couple of young black men as the perpetrators, not in the generic description sense, but actual people. Dolly said they had planned to set up two men she knew. They had hung out together, done drugs with them. On the night of February 13th, Dolly invited the two men to her trailer. They drove over, were hanging out with her. Then she said to them, "I gotta go take care of something. Y'all just hang out. I'll be back shortly." Dolly told the investigators that she took a cab to the convenience store near Tasha's house. She walked to the Detterer house. A stepladder had been left out for her. She climbed up the stepladder and through the window. Phillip had previously loaded the gun, chambered around, and wiped it down so there would be no fingerprints. He loaded the gun for her because she didn't know how to do it. She had never fired a weapon. She had never held a weapon. Then she opens Doug's bedroom door, sticks her arm in the doorway, and fires 3 or 4 shots without looking. After she shot Doug, she ties up Tasha and Phillip, but loose enough to allow Tasha to make a 911 call. Dolly was supposed to have carried out the rest of their plan, which was to give the vehicle with the gun in it to the two black men in her trailer. The assumption is they would be driving through town about the time there was a bolo, be on the lookout, and they would get picked up. They will take the blame for the murder and deflect any investigation on their end. That was the plan. However, the plan to frame two innocent men for murder went awry. When Dolly got back to her trailer, they were gone. She didn't know what to do. She left the car at the church, then walked back to the house. Before ditching the car, Dolly took the gun. She had put it under her mattress. The .380 caliber pistol was still there when the investigators searched her trailer a few hours later. The plan fell apart so fast that by the time investigators got to her, she hadn't had time to get rid of the weapon. The gun was enough hard evidence to place Dolly under arrest for murder. It matched the shell casings found at the scene, but it didn't prove her account that Tasha and Phillip had been involved. Investigators went back and talked to Tasha and Phillip again. Since Phillip had been the first one to break last time around, the investigators started with him. He would be the most likely to cooperate and tell the truth. And sure enough, Phillip does. He agrees that this is a conspiracy. And according to Phillip, he'd gotten involved in the murder plot for the same reason as Dolly. Tasha told Phillip that Doug was abusing her. Tasha made him believe that she was being hurt and that he had to save her. When Tasha brought up killing Doug, he had tried to talk her out of it. He had urged Tasha to get a divorce. Tasha said she would be left with nothing if she went through a divorce. If Doug died, there would be much more. She told Phillip that there was a $1 million life insurance policy. He was promised that she would move to Kansas, and he would move with her, and they would live on a ranch. When the investigators brought Tasha back in for another round of questions and confronted her with what they had learned from Phillip and Dolly, she didn't deny it. She was open about being involved in a conspiracy to have Doug murdered. She backed up everything Phillip and Dolly said about Doug's alleged abuse. Tasha stated that he had raped her. The morning of the murder was not the first time, according to Tasha. Her statement begins with, "Doug Detterer is a horrible person who has raped me, he beats me, he burns me." In Tasha's mind, Doug got what he deserved. The murder was justified. But would a jury see it that way? At the end of her third round of questioning, the investigators placed Tasha under arrest for murder. She was charged with a conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and first-degree murder. Same with Phillip and Dolly. But was there another person involved in the story? Another name that the investigators hadn't heard yet? Doug's sister is about to make an unexpected discovery. By the afternoon of February 16, 2007, it had been less than 48 hours since Tasha Detterer's husband Doug had been murdered in their home. Within hours, Hopkins County Sheriff's investigators had arrested 37-year-old Tasha, 19-year-old Phillip Freeland, and 23-year-old Dolly Forrest for Doug's murder. Tasha was trying to set up a spousal abuse defense and use Dolly and Phillip to strengthen her claim of abuse. Tasha claimed that Dolly and Phillip saw Doug abusing her. They couldn't take it anymore. Phillip had told the investigators Doug's alleged abuse and his $1 million insurance policy had motivated the murder. But after some digging, the investigators had their doubts. Doug Detterer's life insurance policy was only $25,000, and they suspected Tasha's claims of abuse were also a lie. When investigators spoke to Doug's co-workers, family, friends, and associates, they could not find anybody that had anything bad to say about Doug Detterer. Not one single person ever reported that he had a temper or that he was an angry person, No history of abuse at all. But if Doug wasn't abusive and there was no $1 million payoff, what motivated the crime? The first clue would come that afternoon. 2 days after the murder, February 16th, the investigators had finished gathering evidence at Doug and Tasha's house. They released the crime scene. Doug's family were allowed in to collect his belongings. While Doug's sister, Sophia, was packing his personal effects, she heard a cell phone. She looked around and it kept going off. She found it underneath some clothes on the dresser. It wasn't Doug's phone. Sophia already had his phone. Doug had put his on the bedside table. Sophia had found Tasha Detterer's cell phone. Sophia could see an incoming text. She looked at the log and discovered a series of recent messages. They were saying, "Sweetheart, where are you? I'm waiting at the airport." Sophia called a number. She said, "Who is this?" The man on the other end said, "Who are you?" When Sophia explained that Tasha was in jail under arrest for murdering her husband, the man on the phone became even more confused. He said, "Her husband?" Sophia said, "The murder of her husband." He said, "Wait a minute, she's my fiancée." He was calling from Kansas, and he said that they were engaged to be married. He was supposed to pick her up at the airport that morning because she was moving there. Law enforcement talked to the mystery man. It was then that investigators and everyone else get a sense of the kind of person they are dealing with, the kind of person Tasha Detterer is. The man told the investigators that he had known Tasha for years. Back when she had lived in Kansas, they got engaged before she moved to Kentucky. They had been engaged to be married for 5 years. Tasha's fiancé said he had been expecting Tasha to move back to Kansas to join him, but she kept putting it off because of her oldest son. Tasha had told him she was trying to get custody back of him, so she was traveling from Kentucky to Kansas all the time. Tasha's fiancé told the investigators that he knew the name, Doug Detterer. He even knew that Tasha was living with him, but he never heard anything about them being married. He had no idea. He thought Doug Detterer was Tasha's cousin. According to the fiancé, their long-awaited wedding was finally supposed to happen, which explained all the text about waiting at the airport. On the 14th, she was planning on flying back to Kansas, and they were going to be married and live happily ever after. Was the future husband waiting in the wings Tasha's true motive for murdering Doug? It's clear Tasha wanted out of the marriage. While there was no $1 million insurance policy, there was money, cash Tasha was getting from her Kansas fiancé. He had been sending money to Tasha. He was paying Tasha's bills. He was sending her about $400 to $600 a week to her, supposedly for her living expenses. The total added up to more than $100,000 over the years. Was he also involved in Doug's murder? After interviewing the fiancé, the investigators concluded that he had no involvement. In fact, he probably would have been the next victim because he was not the first person Tasha had tricked out of money. Digging into her background, the investigators uncovered a laundry list of frauds and schemes she perpetrated back in Kansas. She claimed that she was a pastor of a church. She claimed a lot of things that weren't true. She was arrested once for impersonating a police officer. She had a uniform. She had an ID that showed she was a police officer. Tasha Detterer was a pathological liar. She had no trouble convincing Dolly and Phillip to go along with her plot to kill Doug. Phillip believed that Tasha was being abused. Tasha kept feeding him that line. But was that Phillip's only motive? The way she doted on him, it wasn't a natural relationship that you would have with your son's best friend. There was suggestion that she and Phillip engaged in sexual activity. Tasha denied it. As Tasha and her attorney prepared for trial, Tasha confidently stood by her claims of abuse. She strongly believed it was a winnable case, that she would not be convicted of first-degree murder. Will she be convincing enough to pull off an acquittal? After all, she was able to convince people that she was a pastor and even a cop. She could manipulate people easily. So was it unreasonable to think that she could convince a jury that she had been abused? Does Tasha have one more surprise for everyone? On Wednesday, November 7, 2007, Tasha Detterer walked into the Hawkins County Courthouse in Madinsonville, Kentucky. It had been almost 9 months since the 38-year-old had been arrested for masterminding the murder of her husband, Doug. She was laying the foundation for a story that Doug Detterer abused her. Prosecution told the jury, Tasha recruited 19-year-old Phillip Freeland and 24-year-old Dolly Forrest to help her carry out her deadly plan. She was very manipulative. They were young, impressionable, and they played right into her hand. Since Tasha was the alleged key to the conspiracy, the prosecutors put her on trial first. They had a very good case, not an exceptionally strong case. Tasha vowed to fight the charges, But as the trial date approached, something happened that made her reconsider. Phillip turned state's evidence. When prosecutors met with Phillip, they made no promises to him. It was up to Phillip Freeland to decide whether he wanted to cooperate. He can choose not to. Investigators believe Phillip Freeland was genuinely remorseful about Doug's murder. His testimony could be very damaging to Tasha's claims of abuse. He never saw any of that. He lived there. He said he saw no signs of abuse. He never heard an angry word between them. Would he take the stand? When Tasha found out that the prosecution had been talking to Phillip, her reaction was immediate. She threw her hands up and said it's over. A deal was made. When Tasha appeared in court on November 7th, it was to plead guilty to first-degree murder. The judge accepted her guilty plea and sentenced her to life with the possibility of parole after 51 years. The police and prosecutors were satisfied that justice had been served. Doug's sister, Sophia, is satisfied too, but that doesn't make the murder's aftermath any easier. Her grief was compounded by the false accusations of abuse. Dolly Forrest was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. After testifying against Dolly, Phillip Freeland pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Tom's True Crime. If you are interested in more in-depth investigations into the most perplexing crimes, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. What are your thoughts about this case? Please share them with us in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe.